Welcome to our JSON course, so that's JavaScript Object Notation course. My name is Lawrence, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to present this course to you today. I've been a web developer for a number of years, and working with JSON really gives us a great way to transmit and utilize data, especially within JavaScript. So JSON essentially is extended from JavaScript. It's a media type, so the extension for it is JSON, JSON. It always starts and ends with curly brackets. The names are separated with a colon, and each name can have a pair value, so those can be separated by a comma. So the way that it looks is it's a key name value pairs. So we've got our key name here, and then we've got our value. And notice as well that they do have the double quotes around it. And if you've got multiple values, you can separate them, so comma separate them, so we can have 3 different values within the JSON. And we can also use arrays in here as well, so that can notate that we've got multiple values contained within name there. So that would be an array that's contained within an object. So it does look very similar to JavaScript and JavaScript objects, but there are some differences to keep in mind, and we are going to be going over those within the upcoming lessons. So basically, it allows us to structure and organize our data. It's ideal for web APIs, and actually most of the web APIs nowadays are using JSON, so it's a preferred method over XML, whereas XML was a little bit more bulkier, and JSON, of course, is easier to read, and when you're doing API requests and you're getting those API responses, more than likely, there's always a JSON option. So this just gives you a quick overview of the different data types that can be used within JSON, and we are going to be reviewing those in the upcoming lesson as well. And there's also various tools that we're going to be looking at, such as JSON lint, and that's going to give us the ability to lint and make the JSON a little bit more readable. So when we do something like this, where we output this into the console, you can see that this is similar to JavaScript. We can also write it within strict JSON format, where we've got the double quotes around that object information for those named paired values. We're also going to look at how we can write out those JavaScript objects. So we know within JavaScript objects, when we create an object, we can write it out with the dot notation, or we can do the bracket notation. So either way, we get the same result and we can output that data. So there's a number of different better ways to output that content. So if we have multiple cars, we can put them within a variable called cars, and then we can contain them, and that gives us the ability to extend on that. And sometimes you will see that JSON does get fairly long, so there is quite a bit of data that can be contained within there. So that's why it's always good to think of structure, how you're structuring that content that's presented within the JSON data. So here's some more examples. So JSON versus XML versus YAML. So there are some differences. JSON's the one here on the left-hand side. So this is one of the easiest ones to read, write, and use within JavaScript. So are some differences, of course, between JavaScript. So within JavaScript, we don't need to have the quotes around it. Within JSON, we need to have double quotes. So JavaScript can be single or double quotes. Also, we can't run any functions within JSON either. So we're also going to be showing you some of the tools and resources online in order to use and work with JSON. And then within the upcoming lessons are designed to get you to practice and work with JSON. So we're going to go over the different JavaScript data types. We're going to have got a number of exercises planned showing you how to stringify and parse JSON and bring it back into usable formats and then object formats. Also, how that can be used within local storage, so storing values into your local storage. So you can see that we've got some values that are being stored within there. We're also going to be showing you how to get content from online so that you can get JSON data from my JSON file and then output that within your JavaScript. We're also going to show you how you can use an API and get some random data output into your web application, and then extend on that how we can pull a bunch of information, and then this is all JSON formatted data, and it's a great place to practice and get more familiar with working with JSON. So we're going to show you how to connect to this API, bring it into your JavaScript, and then let you go through the data and output content into your web page. And then lastly, we're also going to show you how you can use your Google Sheet and output content from your Google Sheet into your web application. So showing you how to do that. And then even if you update your content within your Google spreadsheet, you can see that this is being pulled directly from our Google spreadsheet. So when we update it as well within our web page. So this is pulled in from a web API essentially, and it also gives you a great place to practice and become more familiar with working with JSON through using a Google spreadsheet. And then you can easily access that data, update it, make changes to it, and really challenge yourself to return that and retrieve that data back into your web content. So all this and a whole lot more, and of course source code is always included to get you started quickly and practicing working with JSON. So when you're ready, let's jump right in and begin. Welcome in this lesson, we're going to run through some of the resources we're going to be using within the upcoming lessons. So we're going to be using an editor. The editor that we're going to be using within the course is called Brackets, and it gives us the ability to write our JSON code and then render it out within our browser. The browser that we're going to be using is Chrome. There's also a few other tools that we are going to be looking at as well. So if you are interested in using the same editor that I'm going to be using Brackets, available at brackets.io. This is an Adobe product. It's got a lot of really nice features, and another feature, one of the features that I'm going to be using is the live preview. So that gives me the ability to kind of generate out this local machine address where I don't have to use the file protocol. I can use the HTTP protocol. So this is important when you're working within browsers because you want to be able to render things out locally, and within Brackets this is built in. So this is a really nice feature. You could also run a local machine as well, and of course because this is mainly going to be JavaScript and HTML, all you need is a browser in order to render it out. And again, I am using Chrome, and one of the nice things about Chrome is it's got dev tools. In order to open up the dev tools, you can click anywhere on any website and go to inspect, or you can go up here, top right hand corner where you've got the three dots here, go to more tools and hit developer tools. And there's also a shortcut as well with the shift command option, and that will open up the developer tools. So what you see when you open up developer tools, you see that you've got all of the source code, and any elements that you select here, when you go inspect, you can see it popping up here under the elements tab. And predominantly the tab that we're going to be spending most of the time on is in the console. I usually close the doors so I have a nice clean console, and you can also clear out your console this way as well. There are some defaults. So again, I usually default it to dock it to the right side. You can also dock it to the bottom or dock it to the left. So depending on how much space I have, I will dock it to the bottom on the split screens so that I'm not taking up the full screen and I don't have three different horizontal or vertical separations on the screen. So some of the other resources that we're going to be using as well. So there's json.org. So it's got a lot of great information about JSON, and it's got some diagrams, how JSON works. And we are going to be going through all of this within the upcoming lessons. And as you can see, JSON is used in a lot of languages. So there's a ton of languages, and this is JavaScript based, just like the name implies when you look at the name, JavaScript Object Notation. Similar to what you see within JavaScript objects, but there are some slight differences. And we know within JavaScript objects, we can have an object and we've got these pairs values. So we have a string and then we have a value attached to it. We can also have a string, have an array, objects, any one of these different data types. And of course, we are going to be looking at that later on as well. There are some other resources that we're going to be using. So myjson.com gives us the ability to create a JSON file, store it online, and then of course we can grab that within our code. So I'll show you how to do that as well. There's JSON lint. So there's a number of these available online. And this is a really good one because you can paste some JSON in there and you can see if it's valid. So I've got this JSON generator that I've gone to. So if I paste it in here, I can go down here and I can validate JSON, and I can see that this isn't valid JSON, so it's got a string where it's undefined. So we do need to take care of that, and we need to fix that up if we want to have it as valid JSON. And that's because we don't have the quotes around it. So we are going to be taking care of that and looking at that later on as well. There's also this object generator, so it gives us the ability to generate JSON objects. So you see here on the left hand side when we're defining it, so we've got first name, and then we can enter in some values into it there. So we can also do last name as well and just do an equal sign. So on the left hand side is what you would typically see as you're able to read it, and then on the right hand side is the JSON. And as you can see as well, JSON is human readable, so it really makes sense. And this is one of the reasons why everyone loves using JSON, because you can clearly see what data is contained within here. So we've got your first name, your last name, and of course if I take this and if I place it into the lint and I validate it, we see that it is valid JSON. So we've got the valid JSON over here. So essentially this is what we're going to be showing you in the upcoming lessons. And then of course within Wikipedia there's some even more information about JSON, and there's some great examples here that we are going to be taking a closer look at in the upcoming lessons. So having said all of this, what I want you to do now is open up your editor and get ready to write some code. We're going to be starting off by looking at JavaScript objects and then seeing how they relate to JSON. So all of this is still yet to come. Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to be writing some JavaScript, looking at JavaScript objects, and then we're going to see how they differ from JSON data. So first off, let's start out by building up and creating our basic HTML page. I've got an HTML template generator here, so all I'm doing is setting up the HTML, the head tags, the body tags, so that I can write some JavaScript. So within here is where I'm going to write the JavaScript, and we're just going to do it within the HTML page. Also, I'm going to just change the title to JSON. So let's go ahead and write some plain JavaScript. So we know within JavaScript, we can set up variables. So we can have variables that are string values. So they can be, so we can have a type string. We'll just call it tstring. So this is surrounded by double quotes, or you could do tstring2, and we could surround it by single quotes. So we can set up variables within this way. They can also be numbers as well. So this is number. Notice there's no brackets around it. Boolean values, so t booleans. And this can either be true or false. There's also nulls, so it can also be null, and variable can also be undefined. So these are the core data types within JavaScript. So if you go and if you refresh it and we go to inspect, we're not going to throw any errors. All we've done is we've logged different values, and then we can actually access them as well directly in here. So we can go tstring, we can see the value for tstring, tstring2, and so on. It simply returns back the value. And the reason I'm showing you these is because when it comes to JavaScript objects, we've got the ability to do arrays. So I call it t-array. They can contain strings in there. They can contain numbers, contain other arrays as well. So you can have an array within an array, and then this can have a number of different values and so on. So you can do arrays within this type of format as well. And all of these are just different ways to contain values. So you see when you output it here within the console, you can see that array within the array and so on. Another main way to hold data and hold content is using objects within JavaScript. So objects look like this. They've got the curly brackets. And the difference between objects is that they're written with name value pairs, that every value in here will have a corresponding value to it. I can separate it out with the quotes. So now when I refresh this, t-objects, so now if we do t-objects, you can see that we've got our object there. And notice the way that it's outputting it. So it's not actually quoting around there, even though I do have a quote in there. There's different ways. So do t-objects too. And you can see it's still valid. It still works within JavaScript. We can also do multiple different ways. So do t-objects 3. And this time we can use the double quotes if we wanted to. So again, we'll just refresh that. And you see it's still valid and it still outputs the data. You could also define an empty object, so do tObjects4, and then you can place content within there if you wanted to. Just declare an empty object, so it's just the curly brackets, and then afterwards you can place data in there, so you can do tObjects4 dot, and then we can specify it with first, and then we can equal it to Lawrence again. So same thing, same idea, that we're still adding in data and information, and we still get the same results. So they're still all equal. And then you can also add values. So we can do tObjects4, and let's do last within this type of format. So you can also use the bracketed format. So let's refresh one more time, and we'll output the contents. And you can see that we're still able to add in values. So there's a number of ways to work with these values once they're within JavaScript and once they're within a way that we're holding all of these values and associating it with the variable. And then all we need to do is reference the variable, and we can get access to the information contained within that variable. You also will see different combinations as well. So you can have different combinations of tObjects5 where you might have an array. So we'll call it myArray. And we're going to do this within an object format. So this is going to be an array within an object. And you can link to the different variables. So I'm going to grab the one that I have here. And let's refresh one more time. So you can see that you've got the array contained within the object. You can also add objects within objects as well. So we can do tObjects, and let's do it within a different type of format. So we'll call it myObject. Let's go ahead and add in tObjects4 into here. So we'll refresh it, and 5. And now you can see that we've got an array, we've got an object, so we've got an array within our object, we've got an object within our object, and we can still reference these values if we wanted to. So we could do tObjects5, and then within here, we can access, so if we want to get access to the myObject value, we can see that that outputs that there. And then if we want to get the first name, we can output it this way as well. So as long as we have a way and a path to reference those values, we can always get to those values contained within there. So these are just different ways of storing information into our JavaScript variables and then accessing that information later on as well. The more familiar you are with the different data types and how JavaScript can access data and how you can access the data that's deep within inside an object within an array, the easier it is to be able to traverse through your JSON objects. So I want you to try this out for yourself. So go ahead and open up your editor, or you can open up your browser and create an object. So you can just do something like variable myObject and create an object. And then within the myObject, you can add in content. So you can do something like first. So now you can see that within myObject, we've added in first. You can also add in last as well. And just get familiar with adding in content into JavaScript objects. So try it out for yourself. Open up your editor or open up your browser, DevTools, and open up the console and try creating JavaScript object and then adding in first your first name, your last name, and then outputting that object. So you can do it within the editor. Of course, within the browser, when you write this code and you refresh it, it's going to be gone. So it's only available in that instance. If you want something more permanent, then create it within your editor. Try it out for yourself and build out your JavaScript objects. I know you're here for JSON, so let's jump right into using JSON. So in the previous lesson, we looked at JavaScript object, and we also saw that it's very similar to the way that JSON looks. So if we create a variable, let's call it myJSON, and we can set it up as a JavaScript object. And then within here, if we have a name And make sure that you're double quoting around when you're writing JSON format. So it's the same type of format where we've got a name and there's a value associated with it. So the same way that we could get those JavaScript objects, we can also get the JSON object. So if I just wanted to get the name, I could do my JSON name using an object format, and then we can return back the name. I can also do it within this type of format as well, where we could do the bracketed format and I can return back the name as well. So these can be used interchangeably, and the difference really here is that this way can be made more dynamic, and I'll show you a little bit more about that coming up in the later lessons. So let's open up our browser again where we had it before, and we had all of the different JSON validators. And let's take our JSON code, and we should probably add in something else in here as well. So because it's a set of different paired values, with commas separate them out. So if we wanted to do something like age, and I'm not going to give you my real age, but we'll just do 30 for now. So you can see that when I go back out here, everything is still working the same way. So if I return back that my JSON, I can output it, I can see the name, I can see the age, and have access to that data. So let's try that out and add it into the validator. So what do you think will happen here? And so I'm just going to clear this out, and I'm going to copy and paste my JSON object. And do you think it's going to be valid when I press validate JSON? What do you think is going to happen here? And if you said it is valid JSON, you are correct, because the format that I was writing it within the JavaScript here, we did make it a valid JSON object. So if you take, again, that JavaScript object, and this isn't going to be JSON, although it's going to work within JavaScript, it's not going to work within the JSON object. So if I was to take something like this and copy and paste it in, and validate JSON, we see that this is no longer valid JSON because it's looking for those double quotes. So if I do update it with double quotes, but let's say I change these to single quotes, what do you think? Valid JSON? Not valid JSON. We know that it works within JavaScript, and we see that this is not valid JSON. So it's expecting a particular format, and double quotes, single quotes are not interchangeable within the JSON format, so it needs to be double quotes, and we also need to quote around the named value. Because within JavaScript, we can have these names and we can use them interchangeably, but if we will have a name, and if we do something like first, within JavaScript, generally you're going to shy away from doing it within this type of format because we can't have the spaces there. But within JSON, when we go over here, we see it's still valid JSON. So whereas if we left this space within JavaScript and we go back to our JavaScript object, do you think we're going to throw any errors when I refresh it? And if you said no, you're going to be correct, that we don't throw any errors, and we can still reference this object, but we always need to quote around it. We can't do something like my JSON and then, so it becomes really problematic. Like I can't do name space first because this just won't work in JavaScript. There's a syntax error because it doesn't accept those spaces. And the other thing too is when you're creating JavaScript objects, you can't have them with a 1 in front or something like that. So that also, keep that in mind. So usually the best way to do JSON as well is to try to keep it similar, not use the spaces if you can avoid it. If you really have to use them, it's still going to be valid, but it's just not good practice. So the best thing to do is usually try to keep it similar to the way that you'd write it within JavaScript. So do a camel case here where instead of the space, you do an uppercase. There's also other things as well within JavaScript that we can do. So if we wanted to create an object, because this isn't going to be valid JSON, if you do an object here, and let's say within the object itself, you had a function. So this function, so we know within JavaScript, when I save that, and if I go back out to here, and let's go out and refresh, we know that this is still valid, this still works, that I can run this as a function and it contains that function code. But this, for sure, it's not going to work within JSON because again, it's not JSON formatted. That's what, there's a few differences between JavaScript objects and JSON, and this is definitely one of those. And let's just make this a little bit bigger. And then of course, this, if we want to turn it into an object format, we need to do the brackets around there, and I can do test. So now when we go out and if we refresh it, if I do the my object.test and I invoke the function, we see that we're getting that value being returned back, but of course, still not a valid JSON object. So now it's up to you. So try this out for yourself. Create your own JSON object, and then you can go into any one of the my.json or the JSON lint or any of the other ones that are available online and paste your JSON and try out just different formats of JSON and make sure that it's valid. So you're able to write some valid JSON, and you don't have to make it very complex. You can just do just a simple name pair values. So you have a name and a value, name, value, comma, separate them out, and then just do the curly brackets around that object. And I'll show you some more complex stuff coming up in the upcoming lessons. Now that you're comfortable with writing JSON, let me show you some of the really cool features when it comes to JavaScript and JSON content. So if we create our JSON object, and I'll call it my JSON, and let's do something similar to what we had before, and this time let's do first. So do first name, last name type thing, and then comma separate it out, last, then do the last name. So just create a really simple JSON object. And then within here, we can see when we output it into our console. So if we do the my JSON, we see that it's really nicely, easily broken up. So if we want to get to the my JSON and the first name, we can do it this way, and last name as well within that object format. So we're all ready to go when we bring in a JSON formatted object. But there are some cases where you might want to store your JSON object in one variable, such as if you're storing it to local storage, then you do need to store it in as one variable and then save it as a named value, because you can't go through all your JSON objects and save them separately. Not really good idea. So the easiest way is to stringify it. So you take a JSON value and you stringify it. So we'll call it my JSON and we'll call it stringified. So I'm not sure that's a word, but stringified, and we can do stringify with JavaScript. And the way that we do stringify is we do JSON, and this invokes the JSON method, and then within here we've got one called stringify. So we can convert a value to JSON, optionally replacing values, and basically we're stringifying that JSON object, and we can also parse it in. So when we stringify it, we take in that my JSON value, and I'll show you what the difference here is going to be. So when I refresh it, we see that we still have the my JSON if we want to output that. And we also have the my JSON stringified version. And if we output that, we see that this is a little bit different. So we're not actually seeing the first name, the last name, it's all quoted. So this is the same as within just any string value. This is a string value of the JSON object. And the reason that we do this is because this allows us the ability to convert our object into a string value, and then we can save it and send it to a server, a web server, and also we can store it into values where we need to use it as a string value. And then to get it back into a usable format, so you'll find sometimes with JSON it is within a string value, so then you have to bring it out of that string value, and in order to bring it out of the string value, so we'll do the same thing, my JSON, and we'll call it parsed. So this one is using the JSON object again, and parse transforms it back into an object. So if I take that value, so remember this is the stringified version, and if I place that in there and refresh, now if I do the my JSON stringified, we're still stringified on this, but if I do the my JSON parsed, you can see that it's back within that usable format. So you'll find this within applications that there are times that you want to stringify it, and then if you've got a string version of a JSON object and you want to get it back into a usable format in JavaScript, then you'll parse it back out. So I want you to try this out for yourself. So take that JSON object that you created earlier, stringify it using json.stringify in your JavaScript code, and then you can also access, update it, and so on. And then once it's parsed, back to stringify, and then save it as a stringified value again. So let me show you an example of that. So we see that we start out as a JavaScript object. So this isn't a stringified version. This is one that we can access and we can use. And then when we get to the stringified version, this is just one string value. We parse it back out. And now if we wanted to, we could do the my.json parsed value, and we can update the first name. And we'll change this to different first name. And so now at this point, if we were to console log out our my.json parsed value, we're going to see that it's within an object format. And so we want to turn it back into a stringified version. So let's to send our data, so we'll call it send data. And this is where we turn it back into stringified version. And we're going to take that my.json parsed value, and we're going to turn it back into a string version, and then we'll console log out the string version. So let's try that out. And I know that we kind of jumped through a few hoops here, but basically we start out with the my.json version, and that's not the output from there, but we see that we turn it into a stringified version, so we've got it as a string. Then we parse it back out into a usable format using the JSON parse. Then we update the first name of it, and we output the new version out within JSON parsed, and then we create another instance of it and stringify it again, and then this is the data that we're sending back to the server. So also console log out those other steps in between. So now that we've got kind of a good example, so we'll get rid of the parse there and do this big long one, my.json stringified, so that we can really see what's happening here. So the data comes in and it's an object format. We can make use of it, change it. Then we transform it into a string value. And then we take that string value and we parse it back into a usable format using JSON parse. And then we turn it back, we update it. So that's our update there. We change the first name, and then we turn it back into string version. So the idea here is that this is getting data, working with it, updating it, and then getting it back into our string version where we can send that data and store that data within the value. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that coming up later on, where we're going to store it into local storage. But for now, try this out for yourself. Try these methods, the JSON stringify and the JSON parse, and get familiar with it. And also try updating some stringified values and then parsing it and then updating it back into a string. So switching it back and forth between that string value and the regular object format. Welcome back, and I hope you had an opportunity to try it out. So you're probably wondering, well, why do I need to have a string version and then parse it out? Why can't we just have it within an object format? So let me give you an example. So if you want to store it into your local storage, you can't store it as an object format. So it's showing you the way that that's going to work. Let's first create some JavaScript here, and we'll give it an ID, and we'll just call it button. And we'll say press me. So when we press the button, we want to store that content into local storage. And also, let's create an input field here and give it a type text. And then we'll give it an ID as well. So this is going to be first name. And then when we'll just leave it at that. And then we're going to set up when the page loads. So we're going to grab those values. So let's add an event listener. So we'll just add an event listener directly. We'll get element by ID, and then we're going to grab the button.